Hey everybody, welcome to a mini episode of Relationscapes. I'm your host, Blair Hodges. Sometimes I do an interview and then the topic pops up in the news again. And I'm like, I already interviewed that person. I really want to talk to them about this news story. It's in the news. In these mini episodes, we'll have a chance to dive into the latest headlines with our favorite expert guests. We'll also check out some listener voicemail. And if you're interested in the topic that we talk about today, I'll also connect you with some other cool podcasts where you can learn more. It's a mini episode. What's in the news? What are listeners saying? And where can you learn more? Let's dive in.
Gotta rearrange, 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 rearrange us. Rearrange us. Rearrange us.
Childless cat ladies have been in the news thanks to J.D. Vance, the current Republican vice presidential candidate. And when I heard that, I immediately thought of historian Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. She joined us a few episodes back to talk about her book, Women Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. Now, we didn't mention Vance's statements during the interview, but she actually discussed them in her book, so I invited her back to follow up on that specifically. She's a childless dog mom, and she has some thoughts about women without children being a political football heading into the 2024 presidential election. Before we get to Peggy, though, let's check out the brand new listener voicemail. If you have thoughts about an episode of Relationscapes, you can send me a voice memo. Just do it right on your phone. You can record it and email it to me, blair@firesidepod.org, or DM me on Instagram. And here's our first message from the listener voicemail responding to an earlier episode of the show.
Hi, this is Rachel. I'm an adoptive mom from Utah. I just finished listening to that excellent interview with Angela Tucker. I share so many of the same feelings expressed on the episode. I fully believe that our children get to decide how they feel about their adoptions. My kids didn't get a say in the process that brought them into my family, and for me to expect them to feel gratitude for a situation that stems from a profound loss seems really harmful to them. Over the years, I've watched my son cycle through so many positive and negative emotions surrounding his adoption experience. And I've learned that it's my job as his mom to provide a safe space for those emotions to be expressed and processed. So I really appreciate Angela's knowledge and her willingness to share her perspective as an adult adoptee. I feel like all future and current adoptive parents can learn something from this episode. It is so worth the listen. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks for that message, Rachel. All right, let's get to Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. Peggy O'Donnell Heffington, welcome back to Relationscapes.
Thanks so much for having me back.
I was excited to release your episode because childless cat ladies have been in the news lately, and I wanted to touch base with you because we recorded the interview a while ago, and some of the stereotypes and prejudices about women without children obviously didn't go away after your book was published. I know you maybe...
Unfortunately, I don't have that power.
Exactly. So yeah, let's dig into this. We're talking about Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance, who's made a lot of comments, and then people keep finding more comments from podcasts and interviews that he's done in the past. But one in particular we'll start with here in a 2021 interview with Fox News host Tucker Carlson, back when he was on Fox. J.D. Vance was running for the Senate.
What I was basically saying is that we're effectively run in this country via the Democrats by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it?
Did that one hit close to home? Peggy, you don't have kids, and maybe you're miserable. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I actually wrote about that quote in my book because, as you said, it was from 2021, but it really kind of came back. I mean, he's risen to a new level of prominence, but it sort of came back this summer, maybe to bite him or certainly to bite the party broadly. I mean, one thing I thought was really interesting about it is, we can talk about it. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but sort of the history of claims like that it's both like a very 2020s kind of thing in the rhetoric, but it also reflects this, 2 centuries of bias that my book talks about in depth.
That's exactly what I want to ask you about it, is because you can put it in that historical context, but then show how it gets recycled and kind of rebooted into a new scenario.
Yeah, I mean, the threat that childless women pose to American civic life, that's a really old one. We talk in our episode, and I show in the book that dates back at least to the early 19th century, that in the newly formed American Republic, there was this idea that women's primary civic contribution was supposed to be creating new American citizens, right? Like having babies and raising them to be good citizens.
And don't even need to vote if you're doing that, by the way.
Exactly. And that was like their rightful role and also their duty as citizens. In 1905, Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech where he compared women who didn't have kids to soldiers who run away in battle, and that they're failing their country, they're failing to do their duty when their country needs it the most. And he also said they were as useful as unleavened bread. And also he says that the existence of such women, that is, women who choose not to have children, it was one of the worst parts of modern life.
So I take it that Roosevelt had never had like a good pita sandwich if he's saying that they're unleavened bread.
That's true. I think there's a lot of unleavened bread that could be, considered quite delicious and useful. So I think those quotes that I just gave from Roosevelt in 1905, and this idea that goes back a century before him, that the primary way women were supposed to contribute to American society, we can connect those directly to this kind of rhetoric that, they are miserable, and also that they don't really have any business participating in American civic life or American politics or leadership.
I had forgotten that you had included discussion of this particular quote in the book. Was it kind of part of mainstream? Did it pop up in the mainstream back in 2021 when he was running, or how did you even come across it?
I think it was only for those of us who were paying attention to such things. Because, it was when he was running for Senate, I believe.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
So that's when it first came up, but I don't think it really hit the mainstream. Maybe it made one Twitter, news cycle, and I just happened to be quite attuned to that kind of discourse, and that's where I found it. But of course, it came back and went mainstream this past summer.
And there's an element of it too that I want to ask you about, where he continued after saying the childless cat lady thing. He said, It doesn't make any sense to turn our country over to people who don't have a direct stake in it. So he was also depicting women without children as not having a stake in the country at all.
Yes, it's very revealing. This comment is very revealing about J.D. Vance, but also about people who sort of share his views on reproduction. It's revealing in both how he understands like what it means to be a mother, that it is like some specific biological act, but also it's very revealing that he can only conceive of people caring about the future if their DNA is going to be in it. And that's a really narrow way of thinking about like how a person could care about the future or why they might care about the future. It's not about a community. It is about like his DNA will be there and therefore he cares about it. But one of the things I've sort of chuckled to myself about a lot this summer is that the nation's first president, George Washington, did not have biological children.
Right.
And far from that being like a downside to him, or that, his contemporaries thought, he doesn't have a stake in the future. His contemporaries thought it was a great thing that he didn't have children. That was one of the things that they thought made him so well suited to be the first president of the United States. Because, of course, they'd just thrown off a king. And they figured, well, if he doesn't have any heirs, then he won't be tempted to turn this into like the Washington dynasty. And so I think also, our founding fathers, who are people that someone like Vance would probably lionize, they thought very differently about, the way having biological children made you care about the future and how that suited you for leadership. The historian Alexis Coe has written a biography of George Washington that I strongly recommend. I think it's fantastic. But one of the things that she observes is that in sort of contemporary Washington biographers, like that is the late 20th century, early 21st century, because of course people keep writing his biography.
I'm working on one right now, actually. No, I'm just...
I probably should. It would probably sell pretty well. But she observes that they spend a lot of time trying to explain away the fact that he didn't have biological children, that they blame his wife for being infertile, even though, of course, she had biological children from a previous marriage. Or, they say, well, he was clearly not impotent. He was clearly not infertile because he was such a man's man. And so like they are very concerned about showing that he could have had biological children. When if you actually look at the discourse around his reproductive status at the time, like I said, his contemporaries didn't think it was a problem. In fact, they thought it was a point in his favor, that it was something like uniquely American and uniquely democratic to have someone who was going to serve as president and then was going to step down because they didn't have their own children to install in power. And so, contrast that to the idea that, you can only care about the future if your DNA is going to exist in it. Like, they're very different visions of, what makes someone fit to lead, but also, like, why they might care about the future of this country.
And I think there's a really strong gendered component to it, too, because we can only speculate, but I imagine, like, if J.D. Vance was running alongside someone who didn't have their own kids who was a man, I don't think the childless cat lady discourse would come up at all. I don't think that JD necessarily would hold men to the same account that he's trying to hold women to, of like, your real purpose is to reproduce, basically.
Yeah. And I think if Harris were elected, she would be the 6th president without biological children. But of course, the other 5 were men. So it was, it sort of never came, it never came up as an issue.
And I can't name any of those other than George Washington because you just told me that. And I doubt many people could.
Right, exactly. Because it's sort of a non-issue, right? Like it is a footnote in their biography. So I think that is quite revealing. And I also think it fits with that longer history that we were just talking about, women's primary civic contribution being understood as like a reproductive one, that their duty as citizens was to produce more citizens, whereas, men had sort of a broader range of potential civic duties.
Okay, good. Let's zoom in on another part of the J.D. Vance quote where he talks about women being miserable. These are childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives. So not only is he talking about the fact that they don't have a stake in the future of the country, but he's also talking about their emotional lives. He's talking about them being miserable because of this.
The rhetoric that has been used to try and emphasize to women that what they should be doing as Americans, as citizens, as women, is having children. I think you can trace that all the way back to the 19th century as well. And I mean, you can hear it a little bit in Theodore Roosevelt's speech that the existence of these women is like a terrible part of modern life. I think he calls them miserable creatures. So there's very sort of parallels in the language. And I think, there's one piece of that is just like a rhetorical component. If your goal is to convince women that the thing they should do is have children, then you're going to say, well, it's also the thing that's going to make you happy. And if you don't do it, not only are you failing as a citizen, but even if you don't care about that, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah.
But there's also, I was thinking about that sort of in preparation for our discussion, that in the middle of the 19th century, as we talk about in the episode, across the 19th century in the United States, fertility starts to fall. And, women are having fewer children fairly dramatically. And the groups of women whose fertility drops the most were native-born white women who were well off, who are increasingly in the 19th century becoming educated and starting to think about things like political participation and professions, like participating in, traditionally men's professions. And there is a lot of work, like rhetorical work, done in that period about how those things make women hysterical, make women unhappy, make them infertile, which is sort of understood to be a symptom of how unhappy a woman is when she reads too much, or when she participates in business, or when she becomes educated. And so I think like that piece is paralleled in this language too, that it's, people unhappy about women's reproductive choices are emphasizing not only how they're failing to do some kind of civic duty, but also how they must be miserable.
It made me think, too, of women who are dealing with infertility who want to be mothers. I mean, there are some women who definitely do experience a sort of misery in not being able to have kids in the way that they hope that they would. So my heart also went out as these comments were being spread far and wide to women who do feel a sort of misery around the reproductive limits that they face.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that original quote from 2021, Vance name checks, I think it's Kamala Harris, AOC.
And Pete Buttigieg, too.
Pete Buttigieg.
Who has kids now.
Right. And Buttigieg has actually come out and said afterwards that when Vance made that comment, he and his husband were attempting to adopt children, and they had just received like heartbreaking news about, that an adoption they hoped would happen wouldn't go through, and how much those comments stung because they were like trying to become parents and just had this heartbreaking setback. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's like you can never know what someone is going through. But also, it is like careless and thoughtless about viewing people who don't have children and assuming that that must be their choice when that is, we know that that's not true, that there are people who very much want children who don't have them. And especially, I mean, couple that with Vance's stance on IVF, which sits very strangely alongside rhetoric about how important it is for people to have children. He voted against a bill in the Senate that would have protected IVF from state level attacks of trying to limit it. And so, on the one hand, he's saying, you have to have children. And on the other hand, he seems to be, at least on a policy level, like not wanting to help them do it if they're having fertility issues. And so I think that makes the comments sort of sting all the more.
Yeah, that brought to mind old eugenic conversations. Eugenics is kind of this old idea that the human race needs to be perfected, and the way to do that is through proper reproductive practices and through having basically the strongest and most fit people should be the ones having babies. Like, eugenics kind of grew out of like, breeding horses for races and stuff. Like, we're going to make the best humans possible. And so I also kind of put his IVF thoughts in that conversation too. Not just the religious side of things, which I think he subscribes to, which is the idea that IVF is kind of playing God, or that it destroys embryos, which is like abortion, but also this idea that it's an imperfect attempt to be a good procreator, and that there's something, if you have to rely on IVF, then you're defective. There's something wrong with you.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. That when he is talking about, women should become mothers or a childless woman is sort of lacking something, he is talking about a biological act, because of course he doesn't seem to be counting like stepmothers like Kamala Harris in the category of mothers, but it's not just a biological act. It's a very specific, like natural, and I'm using scare quotes for your listeners, natural biological act. That is what he is talking about when he says, women should have children. And I think you're exactly right that there is some sort of ideology embedded in there that if you need that needing reproductive assistance is somehow evidence of some greater flaw, or it is, unnatural in some way that he doesn't support.
All right, one more thing I wanted to ask about in some of his other comments is where he's even gone as far as to propose or to suggest that it might be a good idea to restrict voting to people that have kids, or give people with kids more votes, but not to the kids, only to the parents.
Let's give votes to all children in this country, but let's give control over those votes to the parents of those children. When you go to the polls in this country as a parent, you should have more power. You should have more of an ability to speak your voice in our democratic republic than people who don't have kids. Let's face the consequences and the reality. If you don't have as much of an investment in the future of this country, maybe you shouldn't get nearly the same voice. Now,
so he's also kind of thinking how we can tinker with the actual logistics of elections based on how people are reproducing and procreation.
Yes. I mean, it's a wildly disturbing thought, but I think it is also connected to that rhetoric of like the biological children produced by a mother and by a family are their civic contribution. And so if you have like been good citizens and produced a whole bunch of kids, then you get rewarded by, having greater political participation. I think it's like I said, a very sort of disturbing idea, but it is also quite logical if you're thinking along those lines.
He would want to point to things like crime and delinquency, children delinquency, in a way that a lot of Americans actually do, which is to say, if you come from a broken home, if your parents are divorced, if you have a single mothers are especially singled out, your chances of engaging in criminal activity are higher, your future income possibilities are lower. And what they want to do is blame family structures instead of looking at things like the economic conditions of those families. So you'll have a single mother who's economically well off and can help her kids and maybe get them tutoring or be more involved in their life because she has more free time. She's not working all the time and is away from them. They don't look at the conditions. They just look at what the family structure looks like. And so it's easy to just blame people's family structures and organizations without looking at broader systems and saying, oh, actually, this is more about like poverty or this is more about structural inequality than it is about the exact shape of your family.
Yeah, and I think there's been a really fascinating and revealing breakdown of what the term pro-family means or what it should mean.
Yeah.
And that for someone like Vance, if you look at, his public statements and his preferred policies, it seems to be that he is sort of pro-birth, but not pro like taking care of children or taking care of families. And I do think that that's been really interesting. I think you see this in fights over things like free school lunch, which are, policies that are advocated by Democrats. But you could very easily argue that those are, very pro-family policies. Like they directly help families and probably also help people feel like they can have bigger families if there is support for children and for parents.
Or I was thinking of the program that Nixon destroyed, which was like more childcare that would have really opened up more possibilities for moms and dads. And that's another example of where if you listen to our longer episode, you'll learn about that part of history that could have changed the trajectory of of America if it had gone through in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of my favorite like counterfactuals to just run in my free time as one does, that had the policy for universal daycare, which passed the Senate and the House in 1972, had that not been vetoed by Nixon, like what would our fertility rate look like? Would we be having fewer babies every year? I mean, it's of course there's no answer to that, but I think it's it's worth thinking through that, like if those real pro-family policies had been put in place to make it easier for people to have children, would we be having more children as a country?
And there's also the racial component too, and we talk a little bit about this in the episode where we don't hear J.D. Vance talking about immigrants and their fertility rates. The concern seems to be about white fertility rates, not about fertility rates more generally. In fact, higher fertility rates for people who aren't white seem to be alarming to people like J.D. Vance. And so it's it's really about whiteness as well.
Absolutely. And that is a mirror of the way the concerns looked in the 19th century among, eugenicists and people who were concerned about the racial composition of the country. They were concerned about native-born white women having babies, in part because they saw that immigrants had a higher birth rate. And so it wasn't that the overall population of the United States was a concern. In the 19th century, it was growing, quickly and exponentially. It was that the racial composition of the country was potentially going to change. And I think you see that concern again today, that it is, it is about race as much as it is about population.
All right, let's talk about you personally a little bit and how these comments hit you. So for people that haven't heard the episode yet, Peggy doesn't have kids, not really planning on having kids as far as the last time we spoke. When you hear comments like this still being made, and they're not disqualifying really for a candidate, like J.D. Vance he's the vice presidential candidate for an entire political party, and they might hurt that party in the election. That remains to be seen, but it's at least acceptable enough to where he can still stay in the race and continue to make those kind of arguments. So on a personal level, when you hear that stuff, is it discouraging? Is it annoying? Like what kind of conversations are you having with your partner, with your friends?
Maybe the most, I guess when I originally read the comments, I found them to be sort of annoying and dismaying. But one of the things that has surprised me the most this summer in their sort of reappearance is how poorly they have stuck as an insult. I mean, you had even Republicans, there was a lot of reporting about Republicans trying to, tell them like lay off the attacks on Harris's reproductive status because, there's a heck of a lot of stepmoms in this country and they vote. But even for people who fit the description of childless cat ladies, there was sort of an immediate response of like, hell yeah, let's make T-shirts, sort of like an immediate identification with that with something that was intended as an insult, but it just really didn't seem like it landed as an insult. It didn't seem like it went through a process of being like, oh, this stings and we're upset about it and we're offended about it and now we're going to reclaim it. It was just like immediately like, let's make cat ladies for Kamala t-shirts. And so I think that is quite interesting, that it's just not really sticking as an insult, or the people it is directed at are perfectly happy to sort of take on that mantle. It's gone even a step further in after the DNC when Gus Waltz, Tim Waltz's son, sort of had an emotional reaction to watching his dad that I thought was lovely, to watching his dad give his speech. There were some really, I think, cruel comments from prominent conservative commentators sort of making fun of him. And there was this moment on the internet where it was like the Childless Cat Ladies of America had sort of adopted Gus Waltz as, they became adoptive aunties of Gus Waltz and were sort of saying, you have to come through us to get to him. And I thought that was so interesting because it was this group of people who has been cast as hating children saying, like, no, we're not the ones who hate children. In fact, like, we are going to love this child that you are attacking. And so it's like this identification, sort of joyful identification with something that was intended as an insult and that did sting as an insult for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah.
And a willingness to say, even though that is my identity, it does not mean I hate children. In fact, I might love them more than you do. And so that's been kind of heartening and certainly fascinating to watch.
I mean, it strikes me that the people who are probably hurt most by those comments might be the people who do want to have kids and can't, like people who are dealing with infertility,
Absolutely.
people that don't have the same kind of opportunities, even like single women who maybe becoming a single mom's not cheap. If you want to go out and, do artificial insemination or different procedures, like the stuff costs money too. So it seems like when he's aiming his ire at women who are choosing not to have kids, that it's really going to be more damaging for people that wish they could have kids and they can't. And so that's why we even saw some Republicans coming out and saying, like, hey, let's not do this, or defending Gus as well, saying, like, don't attack this kid. This is not what we want to do. So, but, we'll see how it shakes out in the election as it comes up. I don't know. And we should mention, too, you're not a childless cat lady because you don't have any cats, but you do have at least one dog, right?
Yes, we have a dog and we're getting a puppy next week.
Yeah.
Because we're nuts. Just, right at the beginning of fall term when I'm going to be
That's what I was
teaching,
gonna
that is a
say.
great time to get a 9-week-old
Yeah,
puppy.
it's like, okay. I mean, we got a puppy 2 years ago now, and I'd forgotten the investment that puppies are. Because we had a dog for 15 years and she had become so perfectly wonderful that, she basically took care of herself in a lot of ways. And then getting a puppy was like, oh boy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happened. Our dog is 6 and she's an angel. And so we're like, how hard could it be? But we don't really remember what it was like when she was 10 weeks old.
Okay. Well, my unsolicited advice for you is, yes, it will be so much work, but it does go really fast. Like puppies aren't puppies for long.
They grow up faster than humans. Yeah.
Well, Peggy, thanks for talking to us again. I want to remind people your book is called Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. You can learn more about that book in the episode that was recently released with Peggy. And Peggy, thanks for meeting up again. It was fun to touch base with you, especially because it's just been in the news. So it's great to hear from you and get some historical perspective on this.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me back.
Our first mini episode is coming to an end, but if you're in the mood to hear more about women who don't have kids, I'm going to give you a little preview of a podcast called Refamulating. It actually launched around the same time Relationscapes launched earlier this year, and it popped into my recommended podcasts next to Relationscapes. So I guess it's kind of like my sister show, and I've been really enjoying it. Now, on Refamulating, instead of interviewing authors and academics and specialists, they're talking with everyday people about how family life is changing and how family life changes us. This episode you're about to hear a preview of is called The Child-Free Life is the Life for Me. And if you like what you hear, you can catch the rest of it by subscribing to Refamulating in your little podcast app. All right, here's a preview of Refamulating. The Child-Free Life is the Life for Me.
I'm I'm Julia Winston, and this is Refamulating, a podcast that explores different ways to make a family. Often when you hear the phrase, make a family, it's kind of assumed that you're talking about having kids. But not everyone has kids. In fact, a lot of people don't, more and more so all the time. And that's what today's episode is about, being child-free. Now, I want to talk about words for a second here, because when I say child-free, I'm referring to people who have intentionally chosen not to have children. That doesn't mean they don't like children, although that may be true for some. It just means they've made a conscious choice not to become parents. Childless, on the other hand, childless, is a word that describes someone who wants kids but doesn't have them or didn't have them. Childless is about a lack, an unfulfilled desire, and child-free is about choice. We've all been told that having kids is the normal path, but for the first time, many of us actually feel like we have a choice. And the whole point of this show is to normalize whatever choices you make when it comes to your family. So the choice not to have children is the perspective we're going to dive into today on Refamulating. And we're going to hear from a handful of different people who fully own and celebrate this choice. First, we'll hear from a few child-free people in their 30s and 40s. Meet Liz.
I always knew I didn't want to have children.
Michael.
I like to rent a child for a little while and be able to play and have fun and break stuff and make stuff and all of that, and then go home.
And Gabby.
While I would be a good parent, could be a good parent, I don't want to. And so how well am I going to do something that I don't want to do? How well do you do a job that you don't want to do? I think it's a scary conversation to have, and people are just starting to have it more.
And then we'll get a fresh take from someone who's been there and done that.
Someone asked me what my word for my 60s would be, and I said, it's just pure fucking joy.
That's Heidi Clements, a 63-year-old social media influencer who's oozing with confidence about her choice to be child-free.
Even if I was the only single child-free woman in America, I would not feel alone. It makes me feel different. What's wrong with being different? I think it's cool that I didn't choose the same path that everybody else did. It makes me unique. Doesn't make me alone.
This woman is such a badass, and I can't wait for you to hear everything she has to say. Before we hear from these folks, I want to bring another voice into the mix. Someone very special who you may be familiar with. My producer and partner in Refamulating, Claire McInerney.
Hello.
Claire and I are both child-free, and neither of us are sure if we want kids. It's something we talk about a lot. So, Claire, in 3 words or less, what is your stance on having kids?
I don't know, I think would be my answer.
Yeah, me neither. That's my 3. So Claire made a terrible thanks for asking episode last year called Should I Have Kids?
One of the intrusive thoughts I kept having was, if I have kids now, will I be setting them up to be soldiers in the water wars? Will they ask one day, why did my mother have me when she knew humanity was going in such a bad direction? I was in this position of, I kind of want kids, but should I have them? Is it responsible to have children with the knowledge I have? Is it selfish to have kids if their lived experiences will certainly be worse than mine?
Claire, I think so many people can relate to you about this questioning. This is a topic that's on everyone's minds in one degree or another. And when it comes to having children, I think that it certainly is a factor that plays into people who are doubting. Are there other reasons that you consider not wanting to have kids?
Yeah, I mean, the climate anxiety, what the future will look like, is a very real fear I have, but it's probably the most extreme. I also look at parenting as a really intense job. And I think if I did it, I'd want to do it well. So I know I'd give up a lot of my life and what it looks like right now. And then the logistics, things like money, childcare, having support, I see how hard that is for other people. And I know that that would also feel like a huge life change. So those are kind of the things that hold me back. And I just sit so squarely in the middle, knowing that I think I would like many parts of it. I think I could have a great life without them. And that's my struggle, is neither side pulls me super hard.
You know, one thing that's just interesting about what you're saying and where I am is the different phases of life we're in and the different life circumstances. So you're younger than me. You're also partnered. You're 33. You are in a relationship.
Yeah.
I am 40. I'm single. And for me, it hasn't really been a question of whether or not I want to have kids as much as it has been, who is the person I want to have kids with if I end up having kids. I have always been sort of like, if I have children, I know I want to do it with a partner, and I haven't met a partner that I would want to do that with yet. I froze my eggs when I was 33, and it was honestly the most empowering decision I've ever made. It enabled me to freeze time. So in a way, there is a part of me that's not really worried about having kids, because technically I can do it with my 33-year-old eggs anytime. Like, I can do it.
When you and I started making this podcast, the topic of child-free by choice was something we knew we wanted to talk about and tackle right away, because we are in our 30s and 40s. Everyone around us is either like they're having kids or not. It's the time. And so I feel like this conversation is happening around us. So it's really important for us to make an episode that celebrates the child-free life, even though you and I aren't cemented in that camp. We just are hanging out there right now.
It's sort of a medicine that we're wanting to take of like, hey, show me what it's like to embrace the choice not to have kids. I need to see more models of people who are like, yeah, I don't want children and I'm fine. I want to see more of that. I want to hear more of that. And I know more of that is happening all the time. So that's what today is really about. It's us, you know, opening that door and seeing what's there.
If you like what you're hearing so far, you can listen to the rest of this episode by subscribing to Refamulating. Julia talks to a few different people without children, and each of them have different reasons and reactions to what their child-free life has looked like. As with Relationscapes, their point isn't to say that one choice is necessarily better than any other choice. The point is just to listen and learn from each other wherever we are on our paths. All right, thanks for hanging out. And remember, you can send me your own reaction to any episode of Relationscapes. Send it to listener voicemail. You can email me at blair@firesidepod.org or DM me on Instagram. We'll see you next time on Relationscapes.
Gotta rearrange.